Hello, welcome. My name is Kerry Hill. I'm the Community Education Manager at Anew, Building Beyond Violence and Abuse, and we're with you at Sertoma today, talking about survivors with complex issues, and we're going to specifically focus today on homelessness and aging. We're recording today, and we will be sharing out the recording for anybody who wants to revisit the topics or anyone who had to miss today. Just a heads up that you are free to enter any questions or need for clarifications into the chat, and you can also take yourself off mute and just interrupt me and we'll try to clarify in the moment. I'll have a few times where I'll ask you specifically to respond to some questions, either using the chat or just coming off of mute and talking with us. Angela, who did your first session last Friday, giving you the Domestic Violence Foundations, is on the call with me today. She'll be monitoring the chat. And as always, Angela, if there's something you'd like to help clarify or illustrate, please just interrupt me and jump in. All right, I'll get us started. Okay, so today's objectives, we're looking to understand how experiences of homelessness and aging will impact people who are also living with the impacts of domestic violence. We want to see how certain lived experiences, specifically today, those of being homeless or experiencing homelessness and the aging process, being elderly, can heighten the risk of severity, frequency, and lethality of abuse for those folks. So when we talk about survivors with complex issues, we're talking about the simple fact that people who live with domestic violence are not that experience exclusively, that there are still whole people with all sorts of other things going on in their lives that go into their experiences, their beliefs, their fears, their hopes. And so folks who are impacted by domestic violence are experiencing all those other factors, and those factors are going to impact their safety and well-being in the relationship that is violent and abusive. So those experiences and just those people's core beliefs about who they are, how they're supposed to behave in a family, how they're supposed to behave in a relationship, what they can expect out of other people, all of those core beliefs are going to directly impact how folks make their choices, assess what kind of risk they're at, and how they plan for their safety. So we're going to look through those lenses, and I'd ask everybody involved in the training today to really think about what your core role is in your professional capacity, what you do with your consumers, what you've experienced them to need from you, from your agency, and put that as an overlay over everything we're talking about today. I'm going to start with just a brief video.
Nobody should have to choose between staying in an unsafe home or having no home at all. But too often, that's the choice survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have to make. Studies show that access to safe, affordable housing is one of survivors' biggest, most urgent concerns. This is why we can't end homelessness without addressing domestic and sexual violence. More than 80% of women with children who are experiencing homelessness have experienced domestic violence. And women are at a heightened risk of sexual assault before, during, and after periods of homelessness. Survivors of violence face real barriers when trying to access housing. Barriers caused by the power and control dynamics of abuse, a need for safety and confidentiality, economic instability, and the effects of trauma. And these barriers are often greater for those who are most marginalized in our society, including families of color, Native Americans, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and individuals and families living in poverty or who are geographically isolated. So if we are going to end homelessness, we have to understand the connections between domestic violence, sexual violence, and housing instability, and create a framework that responds to the unique challenges and opportunities this intersection creates. In order to meet the needs of survivors and their families, we also need a greater range of housing options, from emergency shelters to transitional housing, to rapid rehousing, to permanent supportive housing. We need to continue to build the capacity of housing and homelessness programs to support survivors' safety, autonomy, and self-determination. And we need to build and strengthen partnerships between domestic and sexual violence organizations and housing and homelessness programs at the local, state, and national levels. These partnerships will give us the resources, strategies, and support we need as advocates, and the programs and policies that will support survivors' safety and stability. Together, through partnerships like these and survivor-centered policies and practices, we can end homelessness and improve families' lives. Learn more about survivor-centered housing at safehousingpartnerships.org.
Okay, so what they talk about in this video focuses a lot on the intersection of domestic violence, sexual violence, and homelessness. But there at the end, they're talking about it's these partnerships amongst people, agencies, organizations that provide support services for those experiences that we will really do our best to support survivors. And so I would add in partnerships like this with Sertoma, because there's such a high correlation between mental health concerns, mental health issues and experiences, and domestic violence itself. And so today we're really looking at where we have mental health and domestic violence, what's happening when we add in homelessness, we add in aging, things like this. So I want to start us off with a question here. We'll just deal with our first question there. What are some of the mental health impacts you've seen with the consumers you work with experiencing homelessness? So again, feel free to add into the chat or take yourself off mute and share your thoughts here.
I think a lot of times, and I don't know if I'm answering this correctly, but I think a lot of times with consumers experiencing homelessness and having mental health, there's not a lot of, I would say, resources that they can find for themselves to, receive the help as well, which can impact all dynamics of their lives, whether that is, finding jobs or, as I see Adrian in the chat says, anxiety or paranoia and things of that nature.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Thanks, Angela. Yeah, I think you're right that the experience of being homeless or just not being able to access safe housing really does impact people's ability to try to find resources that are available. It can become, because of, as Adrian has added into the chat, high levels of anxiety and paranoia. Perhaps they know that there's a resource that could help them, but they don't trust it, or they are fearful of trying to access that. Maybe people won't treat me well, that kind of thing. And so when we are seeing that nexus, that's going to amplify all of the impacts for a survivor of domestic violence that they are also experiencing. You'll remember back to the foundational session that Angela facilitated last Friday, that there's a lot of depression, PTSD, profound fear that's been caused by the abusive partner. And so when you add that into the fear, anxiety, paranoia around the experience of homelessness, that can really exacerbate somebody's ability to take advantage and tap into resources that are there to support them with this. So I just wanted to look a little more closely here. Rates of mental illness among people who are homeless in the United States are twice the rate found for the general population. So I'm getting this from the American Psychological Association. And again, I want us to really look at and think about, what does that translate into real life, right? It's easy to read a stat or something and say, wow, twice the rate, that sounds bad. And it does, but what does that look like in the day-to-day for somebody who is living with both homelessness, domestic violence, and high levels of mental illness? All three of those experiences are high trauma experiences. And what we know about trauma impacts is that can impact people's cognitive ability. So their ability to think through their situation and figure out what needs to prioritize and how to ask for help for those needs. That can impact people's listening abilities and ability to retain information. So for example, you've got a consumer that has come in because they're dealing with the impacts of their mental illness, anything on the range of mental illness. Say they come in and they're dealing with generalized anxiety disorder and perhaps major depressive disorder. So all the symptoms that you all in your capacity as service providers around mental health know what those typical impacts and symptoms are going to present as, particularly when somebody's in crisis. Now you add in that they are not physically or emotionally safe in their home because their partner is abusing them. Perhaps they have come to you and they're saying, I got to get away from my partner. They're hurting me. They're running me down. I can't tell the difference between reality and because my fear is so high. So what does that mean then for you in your capacity of working with this person? How are you going to let them know that you're hearing them? How are you going to let them know that their safety is important and that you're there to support them with your work and maybe referring over to Anew, for example? But also, how are you ensuring in that moment that this person who's having a severe trauma reaction and is also dealing with all the things we've already talked about, no safe place to stay, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and domestic violence, are they really taking in the information you're giving them? Or is their trauma so great that they kind of can't remember what you've told them? Are you able to write things down for them? What do you want to prioritize, right? So let's keep going. 47% of homeless women meet the criteria for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. That's twice the rate of women in general. So again, how might that number go up, and what does that tell us about working with people with major depressive disorder, homelessness, and domestic violence? This tells us that whether that person identifies as having a major depressive disorder, whether they're diagnosed or not, if we know that they are struggling to find safe housing, we know that they're dealing with domestic violence, we know that the likelihood is very high that they are going to also be dealing with a major depressive disorder. So how does that shift how you want to work with that client? What other support services do you want to partner with? Thinking back to our video, who do you want to partner with and pull into this person's orbit as options for them to engage with? Do they need counseling at Anew to help them understand the violence that their partner has been doing to them? Do they need private therapy with you or some other provider to help deal with the symptoms of their major depressive disorder and to understand causes, triggers, supports, well-being practices, perhaps medication, all of the options that somebody dealing with this disorder might need? And how can you then also intersect with homelessness providers? Whether that's through Anew, because we do have some programs I'm going to talk about, or whether that's through, for example, the Alliance to End Homelessness and working with folks to get into non-domestic violence specific housing that might also be appropriate for them. Okay. So let's talk about homelessness and DV specifically. We're starting with a small stat here. Between 22 and 57% of all homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. So we're seeing a high correlation here. It's not that homelessness causes DV or that DV causes homelessness, but they go hand in hand very frequently. This is one of the barriers that you may remember Angela talked about in her foundations training last Friday, that often is a barrier to people, women, men, anyone, leaving an abusive partner, is that they don't know that they have a safe, reliable place to move to. They may be fearful of going into shelter. As you heard in the videos, if you were a woman going into homelessness services, your rates of sexual assault go pretty high. So there may be a lot of reasonable fear about accessing homelessness services and shelters. So when we talk about that for people, women, men, regardless of gender, when we're talking about homelessness and domestic violence, we're oftentimes talking about somebody who is fleeing an abusive partner. That we're not talking about this person needs to be in a homeless shelter for an indeterminate amount of time, but that they need somewhere to go to so that they can successfully and safely leave an abusive partner. So then we need to look at how are homelessness shelters set up in general, and are they domestic violence and trauma informed? Many are, and I know there's a lot of work towards doing that, but shelters that are not domestic violence specific aren't always set up to use best practices for people impacted by domestic violence. Oftentimes they're co-ed. So if you are in a heterosexual relationship where your partner is abusive, perhaps they enter shelter with you, or perhaps they stalk you and find where you are and enter shelter, even though you didn't enter together. You also may be feeling unsafe around people of the opposite gender if they represent the person who had been abusing you. So there can be a lot of fear, again, impacting people's ability to really engage with a support service that can help them transition into a safer lifestyle. We also have screening processes that may not be protective of the safety of domestic violence services. Oftentimes we can see screenings being done with couples. So say I go into shelter with my partner, Angela, and say Angela's been abusing me, we will likely be screened together, about why we need shelter, about what brought us there, about all the things that folks get screened for when they're entering homeless shelter. And I will feel that I can't be honest about the fact that I'm here in a shelter because Angela, who's sitting right next to me, is harming me. Because if I'm honest about it, Angela's going to take it out on me. She will retaliate with further abuse. She is likely sitting there giving me messages, nonverbal messages that I should not be honest about it. She might be pinching me or holding my leg or squeezing my hand under the table. She might be mean mugging me. She might have had a talk with me on the way into the homeless shelter saying, you better not say a word about our business, right? All of that can be part of what gets hidden in a screening when we screen with couples without recognizing that there might be an abuse dynamic there. So for best practices for domestic violence informed and trauma informed screening would be you only are screening one person at a time, right? That increases the likelihood that I will be honest, that an abuse survivor will be honest about their experience and what brings them to shelter. It also protects that person's confidentiality in a much stronger way. If I'm one-on-one with the shelter representative doing my screening, the door is closed, we're in an office, people can't overhear us. Maybe they've got a white noise machine, as a lot of places do, to protect conversations that need to be confidential. These are all going to support that survivor in a much deeper way. So let's look at some of the supports that we can surround domestic violence survivors with who are dealing with homelessness. Research indicates that families receiving a housing subsidy after exiting shelter are far less likely to experience intimate partner violence than those who do not. So let's stick with that for a minute and think back again to Angela's Foundation's presentation. I want us to pull in the cycle of violence. You'll remember that we start in that tension building stage. Say that Angela and I have been in shelter and we're now exiting shelter. We have to find somewhere to go, right? What's our next step? Are we moving in with family? Are we establishing our own home? Are we renting an apartment? Have we been able to get together a down payment for a home? What are all of those things? Those are high tension, high stress situations. What happens after shelter? Where we also have domestic violence in that relationship, that's already going to be our cycle. So when we add in a housing subsidy, what does that do to that tension of transitioning out of shelter, right? That takes some of that fear away. It provides a little bit of a foundation for those folks so that we are more confident that we're able to get into stable housing and sustain it long term. Lots of times people coming out of shelter may be able to get into an apartment, but they haven't had supportive services around job training, for example, or budgeting, or those kind of things. And so they aren't able to maintain that housing in a stable way long term. So that gets us to our next bullet. Supportive services are necessary to move beyond immediate needs. So, for example, lots of things contribute to people living without stable housing, living in poverty, living with domestic violence are two. There's lots of other things that contribute, but what we want to look at today is what are some of the support services through Anew that can really help people end future homelessness, particularly where they're also dealing with domestic violence. So for example, our sanctuary program, and I know that there's a strong relationship between Sertoma and our sanctuary program. Our sanctuary program is a 1 to 2 year stay roughly for adult women with children experiencing homeless who are impacted by domestic violence. They get an apartment if they are admitted into the program, and so they have their own living space that is not shared with other families, all in the same apartment building. But one of the great, most effective aspects of sanctuary is that all other sort of healthy living resources are surrounding those folks. So they aren't just given a place to stay, but they're also giving counseling for the individual adult mother, the individual children, and family counseling to help them understand, process, and heal from the domestic violence that they've experienced, but also to help them deal with the trauma of having unstable housing, which again goes right to our core of what are our immediate needs? Do I have a safe place to stay? Do I have food to eat? And am I able to meet my and my children's immediate needs? So counseling is supporting them with all of that trauma. They're also doing healthy living classes, which are supplemental classes that aren't necessarily therapy based. They're helping them deal with healthy habits in their lives and in their children's lives. This can be eating habits, organizational habits, all sorts of meditation, for example, lifestyle things that can help people deal with trauma they've experienced and the resulting symptoms of a traumatic situation. So things to support people with anxiety, things to support people with depression, all of the very typical kind of things people experience with domestic violence. They are also getting case management. So somebody is working with them one-on-one to set and meet goals. That can be all sorts of things, getting government benefits, housing long-term as they move out of sanctuary. This can be job training and job prospects. They're getting budgeting lessons is not quite the right word, budgeting classes where they're learning about money management. They're learning about all of the things that go into a sustainable budget that will support them in their long-term goals. We've also got rapid rehousing, which is designed to help people who need to move directly into long-term housing. That can be folks living with domestic violence or other impediments to safe housing. So again, it's a great program that we can work with you and your consumers around, whether they have domestic violence or not. It's a way for us to work with folks who are vulnerable and at risk of not having safe, stable housing. And then even for folks who are not in sanctuary or rapid rehousing, people that you've just worked with and through seeing red flags or disclosures from your consumers about living with violence or having had lived with violence, we can work with them around counseling to deal with that experience. And our court advocacy program is a great support for people who have ongoing abuse with either a current partner or a former partner around orders of protection. All of these can be done sort of in combo with one another. And I think one of the great things about the partnership with Sertoma is that they can be doing these services with us while ongoing services are happening with you and your consumer around their mental health. So that neither organization is trying to deal with everything of all the complexities of an individual person's experiences. As always, just jump in if you have any questions. Anything that needs clarification, we're moving out a little bit from homelessness concerns into concerns related to aging. And so if there's, we can jump back and forth, of course, but if you've got anything that you'd like clarified or want to raise about homelessness, just let me know. So I'm going to start again in aging with looking at this through the lens of mental health concerns. So my first question, as it was before, are what are some of the mental health impacts you've seen with consumers experiencing the aging process? What are some of the typical things when you've worked with your folks that you think might be related to simply aging in our society. Okay. Feel free to add into the chat or come off mute, but I'll just go ahead and move on. So one of the first things I looked at was dementia. Dementia affects nearly 50 million people worldwide, and it's projected to increase to 82 million people worldwide by 2050, which the fact that we're talking about 2050 is a thing that's only 30 years from now blows my mind. But that's a huge jump between 50 to 82 million people. So where we're dealing with, again, all of the intersections of these various traumatizing lived experiences, maybe somebody is living with domestic violence, but they're also starting to feel the effects of dementia, right? They're starting to have their cognitive and memory impacted in a negative way, in an adverse way, not able to remember things or retain memories, starting to not be able to build and save new memories. How might that play in a domestic violence situation? Is their abusive partner, for example, manipulating the fact that the survivor is starting to show memory issues? Are they using that to coerce this person? Are they using that to emotionally abuse this person? You're losing your mind. I can't believe you can't remember. We just talked about this. I swear I have to tell you things 50 times. What's that doing then from an emotional abuse point of view? How's that impacting this person? What is that doing, as Angela talked about last week, sort of to their self-talk and their self-esteem? Are they starting to believe those things? I can't remember anything. What is wrong with me? Is the abusive partner also then controlling access to healthcare for this person who's developing dementia? You don't need to see a doctor. You're just stupid. You can't remember anything. Is that emotional abuse again playing in that way, where they're preventing access to supports that might really mitigate the early onset of those dementia symptoms? Let's think next about depression. Depression is, as you all know better than most, I think, a huge mental health concern in our society. When we're talking about the older population, we're seeing roughly 7% of older adults dealing with depression and depression-related mood disorders. When we cross that also with women, particularly impacted by intimate partner violence, we're looking at 35 to 70% of those women dealing with clinical depression. That's 35 to 70% as compared with 12% for the general population. So the general population, people who don't necessarily identify as experiencing abuse in their relationship, huge jump then to 35 to 70%. So some of those impacts that you're very familiar with of depression, subdued moods, not necessarily sadness, but the inability to experience a wide variety of other emotions, inability to experience joy, hope, for example. This depression can often impact people's ability to tend to their hygiene concerns. It can feel impossible to, for example, take a shower, brush your teeth, get yourself healthy meals. You might not be able to physically move. So you start to have physical health impacts from your inability to just take a simple walk, for example. Again, think about how this is impacting older adults, and specifically older adults who are living with intimate partner violence. And what's that abusive partner? Or for the elderly, we can often also see abuse from other family members. So whoever is controlling this older adult, what are they doing? How does that impact their abuse tactics, right? I think we've got that on our next slide. So we've got some unique concerns when we age in our society. What are our health and housing needs? We might be dependent on our abusive partner or abusive family member for taking care of us. Say, just as we were describing in the previous slide, I'm an older adult, I am living with depression, and somebody in my family is harming me. Say my partner is harming me. They're taking care of me in many ways. Are they letting me take meds for my depression? Are they letting me see a therapist for my depression? Are they supporting lifestyle changes that will help me manage my symptoms? Are they feeding me healthy food or helping me prepare healthy food for myself? Are they helping me get out and get some sunlight? None of these are cures, but these are all things that are clinically proven to benefit people living with depression. They're probably not giving me any of that and not supporting me getting any of that, right? Let's think about barriers to obtaining services. So as we age, by the age 50, we start to see a significant decrease in the number of victims or survivors who access DV and sexual assault programs. Think about what goes into that and why that might be. We know that this doesn't indicate that there aren't people over 50 who are experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault. We definitely know there are, but what is preventing people from seeking support services? Do they believe they don't deserve that help? Is their abuser coercing them, telling them they're not allowed to ask for that help? Are there issues related to their aging preventing them from being able to seek out or connect with that? Again, there's always a lot of stigma around domestic violence. Where do we also see stigma around aging in our society? Do we value older adults the way we value youth and youngness and ability versus disability? What of all of that might be preventing people from reaching out and saying, hey, I need to be safe. I deserve to feel safe. How can you help me? Economic concerns. Financial planning is very important for folks as they age, as we either choose not to work or become unable to work or can't find work as we age, for example. We're going to need income still to be stable, maintain our homes, maintain our healthcare, and all of our other needs in life. So how, again, where we cross that with domestic violence, is that impacting older adults? You heard from Angela in last week's first session, again, about financial abuse. If I've been living in a domestic violence relationship, for example, do I have access to money? Do I get an allowance? Do I get nothing? How am I isolated by my abusive partner? What's that going to look like long-term as I age? What happens, say my abusive partner passes away, doesn't leave me any money, and I've never had access to any money? Maybe I'm too young to qualify for Social Security, which again, Social Security isn't necessarily going to provide for all my needs in a very real way. So how is that domestic violence creating, again, such a risk for this survivor as they age? We see a real overlap with domestic violence or intimate partner violence and adult protective services issues. We know we're mandated reporters for adults over 60 or adults with disabilities that would prevent them from advocating on their own behalf. So we may see a lot of abuse and neglect with adult protective services issues that's attributable to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So what we tend to see is that the types of abuse, so all of the information that Angela gave in her foundational presentation is the same, no matter a person's age, but some of the details of how that abuse looks and how it impacts that survivor might change, right? So neglect or abandonment. We're looking at this as a failure to meet the basic needs of someone. So as I'm aging, I may develop health issues, whether physical or mental health issues. I may have financial issues that mean I need somebody to help me take care of myself. So that caretaker might be a family member, it might be my partner. Either of those people might be abusive to me. Neglect or abandonment in this case is going to look like not getting me food, not taking me to doctor's appointments, not helping me socialize with people I like, other family members, friends, adult programming like adult daycare, things like that. Perhaps we live in what can be called a food desert. There's no grocery store that I can access on my own. And so I'm dependent on this person, and this person isn't getting that done for me. Financial. We see a lot of abuse around finances as folks age, right? So somebody might be taking my social security checks, taking my pension checks. Somebody might be signing themselves onto my account and taking my money or using my money without my consent, to benefit them, to benefit somebody else, all these kinds of things, these types of abuse. Again, we see that financial abuse at any age where we have an abusive partner, where we have intimate partner violence. When we get older, again, my ability as the older survivor to advocate for myself can go down very quickly because I'm isolated, because as we saw in earlier slides, I might be dealing with mental health concerns that make it difficult for me to advocate on my behalf. Maybe I am experiencing dementia or depression, both of which are going to impact my cognitive ability to say, this has been my experiences, this is what I need. Can you help me? Okay. Right. Continuing with types of abuse and what that looks like for aging folks. Physical abuse. I don't mean to say, I do want to say, I am not intending to give the message that elderly adults or aging adults are all frail or have no good memory or any of that. What I am trying to say is that these are risks that where we also have domestic violence can get exacerbated by the abusive partner. So as we get older, our physicality changes. Lots of older adults are very fit, stay very fit and active, healthy, that sort of thing. Where we have an abusive relationship, again, whether this is my partner or one of my children or a sibling, brother or sister, somebody who is taking advantage of me, abusing me, gaining power and control over me, they are going to do their best to use physical, emotional, sexual, all other types of abuse to diminish my capacity to stay safe, to get away, to have my own will and agency about my choices. So physical abuse in this context can escalate very easily because of my changing body and my changing physical needs and my physical abilities. Perhaps as we age, we start to get arthritis, for example. We're living with more pain. Our bodies don't do exactly what we want them to do when we ask them to do it. How might an abusive partner manipulate that situation? Are they going to keep pain meds away from us? Are they going to keep assistive devices like a cane or something, or a walker even, out of our reach so that we're dependent on them? Emotional abuse, again, like, look at you, you're helpless. You can't do anything. You used to do, you used to be on your feet all day working your job, and now look at you, can't even get out of a chair without my help. Again, all of that emotional abuse that goes right to the core of a person's sense of self, sense of their own capability and what they're able to do in their life. And sexual abuse. Again, this looks very similar to at any age. But again, what might that look like through the lens of aging in our society? Do I think anyone's going to believe me if I'm, a grandma or something, that somebody sexually assaulted a grandma? We know that that's very possible, right, as service providers, but does our society necessarily reinforce the idea that sexual assault can happen to anybody, including people who are older and elderly? I'm probably likely to internalize a lot of stigma around that and just think nobody's going to help me. I'm just an old granny, and like nobody will want this old granny. Something like that. Excuse me. This can also be a risk for, again, if we go back to the previous slides, thought that we have a lot of overlap here with abuse and neglect of older adults. So adult protective services issues. Am I an older adult who is also potentially being abused in my long-term care facility, my retirement home, something like that? Okay. So before we get too deep into referrals to Anew, I did just want to stop and ask if there were any questions so far, or any of your work experiences with consumers that you've seen any of the issues we're talking about. You want to, ask questions in that context, or need clarification on anything we've covered.
So far, there is no questions in the chat, but again, give some time just in case one
Super.
does pop up.
Thanks so much, Angie. Okay, then I'll go on into referrals to Anew. So again, I'm sure at Sertoma, you're seeing people of all ages and of all kind of different life experiences and what those experiences are bringing to their experience of mental health issues or mental health challenges or mental illness. And where you start to see red flags that they are also dealing with domestic violence, Anew offers all kinds of services that both Angela and I have talked about, and we want to just make it super clear how you can help your consumers access services with us. The hope there, of course, is that the support work you're doing with your consumers could get supplemented, by domestic violence specific support work that folks at our agency could give. And so just increasing safety and opportunities for good health long-term with the consumers you're working with. So we have two main ways that folks would sort of enter services at Anew. I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but I just thought I'd go deeper into that to make it real clear for you how you can connect consumers to us. So hotline, again, hotline is available 24/7, 365, holidays included, the full 9. And it's available, all of our advocates speak both English and Spanish, and they will connect with referral hotlines if somebody is speaking a language other than Spanish or English to make sure that they connect to somebody who can work with them in their own language. So for your consumers, if they are in imminent danger for their life due to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, hotline is best for them. This means that they don't have a safe place to go to, and they need emergency shelter to preserve their life. Their partner is threatening to kill them. Their partner has used severe or lethal physical violence, meaning strangulation, meaning severe beating, meaning use of weapons. All of these types of abuse, as we know, there's a whole spectrum, right? We can go from pinching, which may seem to our ears like, oh, you got pinched, it's not lethal. That's the point. It's still abuse, but that's not necessarily going to put you in danger of losing your life. And then we get to severe, very lethal abuse. When you are strangled, whether you lose consciousness or not, it's one of the highest likelihoods leading to death for survivors. So any of those types of situations, that's going to be hotline for your consumers so that they can get immediately away from that person and into a safe, secure, confidential location where they will then work with our crisis intervention advocate. And that person is there to support that person during emergency shelter, now that they're physically safe, to help them de-escalate the emotional impacts of that crisis situation where their life has been threatened, and help them think through what the options are for their next steps. And that can look like all kinds of things. This is really where we start our empowerment approach, and that crisis intervention advocate is there to help them look through what they want to do next. Is it an option for them to enter a domestic violence specific shelter? Do they have family or friends that they want to go stay with? Do they have the means to establish themselves in a new apartment or home somewhere? Do they want to access a non-domestic violence homeless shelter somewhere? All of this time, then an emergency shelter in that very short-term stay, our average is 2 nights, is really a time to address their primary physical safety needs and then give them a safe time to plan for their next step. So then intake is the other main way that folks tend to access services at Anew. And this is best for when you're working with a consumer who has a reasonably safe place to stay, even if that place is with their abusive partner. Perhaps their partner is abusive, absolutely, but doesn't use lethal violence or seriously severe physical violence with them, or hasn't for some time. Perhaps they aren't living with the abusive partner, but intake is best for somebody who's reasonably physically safe where they are right now. Maybe they're in a homeless shelter, for example. And so they are recognizing, however, that they're either currently experiencing domestic violence or they've experienced in the past. intake here is the best option for this person because they don't need Anew to help them find a physically safe place. They need Anew to help them deal with the trauma of that domestic violence through counseling, through group counseling, individual or family counseling, children's counseling for their little ones. I say little ones, but this is through teens as well. Perhaps they need help with orders of protection. Intake can connect them to our court advocacy program. All those, this is really the best option for your consumers that either disclose to you they're living with or have lived with domestic violence, or through red flags that you have learned through either today's training or the future episodes we'll have in the next 2 Fridays, or Angela's foundational session last week. You're seeing some things that make you question, is this person safe? It's a perfectly appropriate then with your consumer to have that conversation. Hey, do you feel safe in your home? Do you feel safe with your partner? And whether they choose to engage with our intake process or not, it's a way for you to open that door with them. One of my colleagues just said earlier this week in a training that folks may not follow up on that referral in the moment, but long-term you've planted that seed and they'll access services in the future. So the more you're able to let them know Anew is a safe option for you, we at Sertoma trust this agency, the more likely they are to access services at some point. Okay, so that takes us through our end here. We're at discussion and questions, and I've given you my contact info here. I know Angela shared her contact info in the last session, and then I just highlighted here for you the 2 means of accessing services and doing referrals with us there at the bottom. So you've got the numbers. We'll be sending the recording and the PDF by early next week. But I'd love to hear if you need any clarification, you've got questions or anything like that. But I'll just set the stage for you for the final 2 trainings in this series. Next week, we'll be looking very similarly today at folks whose lived experiences create vulnerability and heighten the risk of abuse. And we'll be looking at survivors who are living with substance use disorders and mental health concerns. We're also adding an extra half hour to next week's session because we want you to come ready to talk cases. So we're really going to just do some case review for consumers you've worked with in the past. You could be working with somebody currently, and we just ask that you come prepared to talk through some of the basics of that case where you might be seeing domestic violence issues in a confidential way. So we wouldn't want you to share anybody's names, or I'm sure you're all accustomed to doing that kind of thing. So that'll be next week's session, talking through where we see these intersections of other lived experiences with your consumers. And then our final session, the Friday after that, we'll be looking at assessing and screening and referring for domestic violence and how our agencies can really work together again to give that deeper web of support is kind of how I think about it for the consumers you're seeing and the clients we're seeing who may need services from you at Sertoma to really support them as they're dealing with their domestic violence. So otherwise, I thank you for your time and attention. You can always email me or Angela with any questions about the content or seeking a connection to something else DV related that we can help you with at Anew. Thanks so much and have a fantastic weekend.